Oh, hello there, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of the Sunday streaming version of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about two of who I believe are the most criminally underrated singer-songwriters who really rose to prominence during that late 60s, 1970s era when singer-songwriters were king. Now, songwriting has always been an important part of pop music. It's always been an important part of music in general. But in the golden age of what we now call the Great American Songbook, which features compositions, which features songs written from around the 1920s through the early 60s, although sometimes people retroactively extend that period, these were generally songs that were written by professional songwriters. They weren't necessarily people that you would see performing live. They were, on many occasions, people with very well-known names. Names like George Gershwin, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Cy Coleman, the list goes on. Hoagie Carmichael, who was obviously, he was a performer, he was a singer-songwriter, but he was probably, by the 1950s and 60s, more known for writing songs like Stardust that other people eventually covered. But in the 60s, music, and popular music in particular, changed in two important ways. One, the musical language of pop music changed. The style of pop music changed from that which was derived from jazz and jazz-inspired Broadway music to music that derived from the arrangements and nomenclature, the musical nomenclature of rock and roll. And that remained the case from around the mid to late 60s to the early 2000s. The other big change that happened is that fewer and fewer professional songwriters were in demand. They were, don't get me wrong, but the behemoth that was Tin Pan Alley and the idea of the professional songwriter who would slave away at a piano in a horrible little office, then hand it off to a record company that would then hand the song to a Sinatra or to a Bing Crosby or to an Ella Fitzgerald. That era was giving way to an era where people would write their own songs and then perform them. It was the golden age of the singer-songwriter, although there were people who sort of straddled both worlds. Most famously, in many ways, one of my favorite singer-songwriters, Jimmy Webb, Carole King, you could put in that list. Burt Bacharach was someone who was of that new generation, but continued to write songs for others. So it was by no means a black and white phenomenon, but increasingly people were singing the music that they were playing. And these were the singer-songwriters, armed only with a guitar or piano. They went and conquered the world in the 70s, which was, as I've said before, a decade that was in the realm of pop music the most diverse that we've ever had. You had so many genres that gained people's attention, that gained popularity, that sold records. You had hard rock, you had heavy metal, you had singer-songwriters, you had disco, you had progressive rock, you had country crossover, you had traditional country and western, you had funk, you had a new iteration of soul, you had all sorts of new things going on in jazz, from the avant-garde to the various types of fusion, to classical jazz fusion, to improvisational jazz. And those are just some of the genres. And even though classical music's golden age in terms of record sales was probably the 50s and early 60s, the classical music industry remained pretty strong in the 70s. I mean, Herbert von Karajan was probably at his commercial peak in the 70s, for instance, doing a lot of films. Deutsche Grammophon Records had become a huge dominator of the market as RCA and Mercury, and to some extent even Decca scaled back a bit. Decca was always really part of it, though. So anyway, it was a diverse period in the 70s. And so when it comes to the singer-songwriter world, there were a lot of artists to choose from, many of which were very talented. But two of the ones that I like, that I love, are also two that I find the most criminally underrated, although the people in the know loved them at the time and love them now. And these two, they're both dead, unfortunately, Jim Capaldi and Kenny Rankin. And I don't know who to begin with, so, maybe let me go to one of these websites that allows you to flip a digital coin. And we'll see. Okay, let's say Jim Capaldi heads, Kenny Rankin tails. Flip. Okay. I really should be sharing the screen to show you this, but okay, it's heads. So we'll begin with Jim Capaldi. Now, Jim Capaldi is, for some people, he's best known as a key co-founding member of one of the most interesting, call them a jazzy rock band, a fusion folk jazz rock band, a sort of prototype jam band. They've been called many things, but the band is Traffic, and they're one of my very favorite bands of all time. And Jim Capaldi was an essential member of that band. He wrote most of the lyrics for the band's music. Steve Winwood then would sing most of them. He wrote some of the music too, although much of that was Steve Winwood. But it was a very important collaboration. And Steve Winwood has always said that Jim Capaldi's contributions to the band really kept the band together. He was the band's leader in all but name, and they made such interesting records that really sound so fresh. They're the kinds of records that they're not very dated, because Traffic really did their own thing. They had a very organic sound, but a very interesting sound. It was musically challenging yet endlessly accessible, and it was music that you could both, it was intense and relaxing at the same time. Really interesting stuff. But Jim Capaldi was never shy about having a solo career. He did so when Traffic temporarily disbanded at the sort of in the late 60s, and then throughout the mid 70s to his death in 2004, he continued to write a lot of great music. Now, Jim Capaldi's songwriting cannot really be boiled down to any one specific style. He did folky music, jazzy music, hard rock music, traditional rock music, Brazilian music, because he loved the Brazilian culture, was in Brazil a lot, worked with charities for the poor in Brazil. Disco he did at the persuasion of others, but it was quite soulful and even politically charged disco. But all of his stuff was just amazing. And I really find his ballads to be so compelling. I mean, take for instance Wild Geese from the Electric Nights album. Now, Electric Nights was one of the albums dominated by up-tempo danceable music. Some called it his disco album, and the cover of the album kind of betrayed that reality. But this song Wild Geese is just, it's gorgeous. It's not a disco song at all. It's just a beautiful song, which, if put in the mouth of someone who had a bit more commercial support for their solo career, it would have been a huge #1 hit all over the world. Another one that I really love is from his album The Sweet Smell of Success, which came out in 1980. And this song is Every Man Must March to the Beat of His Own Drum. An absolute beautiful song. And on that same album is Man with No Country, another real emotionally, viscerally wonderful song that Cat Stevens no less covered. Cat Stevens and Jim Capaldi were really good friends, and frankly, I mean, they should have been equally as famous, because there were some similarities, but I would say that the styles that Jim Capaldi explored were that much more diverse. Then you get to 1981, his album Let the Thunder Cry, and again, so many great songs on the album. I'm just sort of going over some of my favorites. Old Photographs, what a song that is. Possibly one of my favorite songs of all time. So definitely check that out. And across all of his albums, you just find really really interesting stuff. And he never stopped. I mean, his final album, Poor Boy Blue, was released the year of his death. He kept on working till the very end, and he did die, unfortunately, young, but he put out loads and loads of material. Another song of his that is incredibly rare, it initially came out on a Paul Kossoff, the original guitar player for Free. It came out on a compilation album of his, released in 1977, and this is the song You and Me, that was written by Jim Capaldi. Now, Capaldi did a version of the song, but with completely different lyrics, for a soundtrack to a boxing film about a boxer called The Contender. So, same song, but two different lyrics. One about a boxer struggling against all odds, another one of the best love songs of all time. You choose which one you love more. Now, Jim Capaldi's music, a lot of his solo albums are on your Spotify's and Whatify's, a lot are not. So, for instance, his album Daughter of the Night is not on that. That has a version of The Contender, but the soundtrack to The Contender is. Electric Nights, which has the wonderful song Wild Geese, is unfortunately not on Spotify. The Sweet Smell of Success is on Spotify, as is Let the Thunder Cry. Albums like One Man Mission and Fierce Heart, which have a lot of his up-tempo 80s rock, really good stuff that's unfortunately not available on the streaming services. Hopefully that will change. And an interesting fact about Jim, the Eagles hit from their reunion in 1994, Hell Freezes Over, Love Will Keep Us Alive, co-written by Jim Capaldi. And it became one of the biggest hits on which he has a writing credit. So at least a lot more of his stuff is on your Spotify's and Whatify's than there used to be. So I would strongly encourage you to check that out. So now on to another great singer-songwriter who is very different but equally compelling, and this is Kenny Rankin. Now, Kenny Rankin was, you could call him a cult classic, but you could also call him someone that those in the know always loved, even though some of his best albums, my two favorite albums of his, still aren't on the streaming services. Now, Kenny Rankin was very close to one of the greatest comedians of all time, the late, great George Carlin. In fact, when Carlin died in the early 2000s, Kenny Rankin performed at his funeral. He created a musical elegy for him, even though Rankin, I think, died only a year or so subsequent to that. He was also someone who was no stranger to television. He was on the Midnight Special. He was on Johnny Carson a lot because Carson loved that weird and wonderful stuff, now didn't he? Now, Kenny Rankin was someone who was a singer-songwriter who lived and breathed the chordal and the harmonic tendencies of jazz. His fingers on his guitar just knew the chords of jazz inside and out, and he was able to create a kind of hybrid style of music that, it looked and smelled like your typical, let's say, Taylor family style of singer-songwriter music, but the chords are unmistakably jazzy, and the chord progressions are unmistakably sophisticated and, again, very much informed by jazz. Now, my favorite album of his came out in the mid 70s, and I think this was probably his most successful album, although it's not on the streaming services. And this was called Silver Morning. Okay, 1974, just looked it up. Wonderful, wonderful album. The title track is a signature song of his. Another great one, Killed a Cat, very, very sad song. Pussy Willow's Cattails, wonderful. He also has a few Beatles covers, but very tasteful, including Blackbird. He has a cover of People Get Ready. It's a perfect version of sort of originals and covers. Berimbu is another great one of his. A couple albums later, he did another one of my favorites, which is just called the Kenny Rankin Album. Now, this album is unique because while most of the music is written by Kenny himself, although there are some covers, it is arranged with a wonderful string section by my favorite arranger of all time, a man associated with the golden age of arrangements. He did so many of Sinatra's albums, including some of my favorites like Sinatra and Strings, Cycles, so many of the ones that sped My Way he did. And he did the arrangements for this album, and it's just a wonderful blend of the very modern jazzy, folky, sort of folk jazz, call it if you will, sensibilities of Kenny Rankin, combined with the lush arrangements of Don Costa, but which were nevertheless very, very modern, because Don Costa was a wonderfully sensitive musician to any sense of music. Did I mention it was Don Costa before? I think I may have forgotten, but anyway, now you know. And again, Kenny was very prolific in the 60s, in the 70s. Another album that actually came between Silver Morning and the Kenny Rankin album was called Inside, another great album. After the Roses from 1980, which is on your Spotify's and Whatify's, is another one that I would consider a classic. And he even did one in the late 80s for the specialty label Chesky called Because of You. And this, again, wonderful music, wonderful musicians, absolutely wonderful stuff. And it's just a shame that the entire catalogs of both of these musicians are not on your streaming platforms, because they really, really deserve to be. It's just excellent, excellent music. And I love loud, dynamic, weighty sounds. So when it comes to a singer-songwriter, they really need to be compelling for me to like them. Because however good the lyrics, you really need the chords and the harmonies to give life to the lyrics. And so when I look at a great singer-songwriter, whether they're performing with a band as Jim Capaldi often did, or in a more stripped down setting like Kenny Rankin sometimes did, although like I said, he played with the lush strings of Don Costa, he's played with great backing bands in his life, but all of that notwithstanding, I need to have that weight and depth of the chordal and harmonic development. And Kenny Rankin brought that in a jazz idiom. Jim Capaldi brought it in a more rock idiom. But both of them absolutely compelling, absolutely unique. The lyrics go places where you wouldn't expect them to go. I highly recommend them. Check them out on YouTube. Buy the physical media if you want. And hopefully one day all of their stuff will be on your streaming platforms, because that is the most convenient and the most prototypical way that people find their music in this day and age that we call the year 2020 something. So that's my 2 cents for today. I really just wanted to celebrate these two great musicians who I've talked about before and will most certainly talk about again. Are you fans? Let me know what you think. Never heard of them? Let me know if you decide to pop your singer-songwriter cherry, if you will, in the comments section. And of course, do the like and subscribe and all of the rest of it. And we will see you next time. Take care.